And we are back once again with Think Fitness Life podcast, brought to you by your host, Matt Gluckman, located in Salt Lake City, Utah. And over there, we got Eric Menchie out of Boston. How you doing today, Eric?
Not too bad yourself.
Can't complain. It's bright and sunny over here. So today, like we talked about last week, we're going to go super in depth into one of the most important exercises that you could be doing, the squat. Bum, bum, bum. And now the first thing I want to get into is some announcements. I know Eric has a little piece from the news he wants to talk about. I have a piece from the news we want to talk about. And then next week, we're hopefully, if everything works out, getting a guest speaker coming in. Our first guest speaker. Wow. And we're gonna pick his brain and talk about his new ebook he just came out with. And I'm really looking forward to getting this guy on here. He's a brilliant guy. He's got close to 20 years of experience in the industry, and he's just a wealth of knowledge. So definitely tune in next week. Send in your emails if you have anything you want to discuss, questions, concerns. Maybe you just want to, send us a funny meme you found online. So it's thinkfitnesslife@gmail.com. Again, thinkfitnesslife, all one word, @gmail.com. So Eric, what do you got for us in the news this week?
Reading through, kind of found an article about, protein intake in adults, and it said 40% of people age 51 and older are not getting adequate protein intake. So roughly a third of that population aren't meeting the standards. And by standards, it went to say at 0.8 grams per kilogram. If someone weighs 150 pounds, that's 54 grams of protein. That many people were not even getting close to that. And that's a big thing because protein is such an important nutrient for the body to maintain muscle health, prevent diabetes, just to be overall healthy.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
So I just found that interesting. And all this other research out there that says, protein's not the magical nutrient, which I agree. It's got to be balanced. But the fact that most people, or a third of people, aren't getting enough protein is kind of like, okay, where do we go back and coach these people up and kind of make them more aware of what they should be eating to help them live healthier lives?
So when it says 40% of adults, are they saying 40% of adults meaning anyone over 18? Or is there a certain age bracket?
51 and older. So this looked at more the older population.
Gotcha.
And they said as people get older, their protein intake overall started to decrease. Now, whether that's from lifestyle or just thinking they don't need as much, people were cutting back more protein and getting more carbs and fats in their diets.
Yeah. Well, my first thought is, and I'm not hating or anything if you're vegetarian or vegan. However, the protein sources, the iron sources, the magnesium sources, all of the trace elements that are important for your body's proper functioning, they are not as bioavailable in a lot of these plant sources compared to a meat source. And it's funny, growing up, my sister would fight to be vegetarian, but my mom just didn't care. Like she let her, for the most part, stay away from meats. But whenever there was turkey, she said, you have to have turkey. You have to have turkey. You got to get a good source protein in. And it was almost instinctual that she knew that peas and lentils weren't going to be enough protein for her. So, if you're doing it for ethical reasons or you're doing it for health reasons, I would just maybe get a second opinion, look into it a little bit more, and research plant source proteins and their bioavailability. But yeah, 40%, way too much for people who are lacking protein. Cool. So my little tidbit was a little article that a friend sent me. It's a couple years old, but I find it's important to discuss. The title of the article says, "Doctors significantly better than Google, according to new research." And I feel like we live in an age of skepticism, which I always promote, a healthy amount of skepticism. You should always try to search for a second opinion. But don't let that second opinion just come from your own logic and thoughts. Research what's out there. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's a reason why people are experts in their field. And now, you can go to a doctor and ask his opinion on something, and you don't have to take it with, you don't have to believe it 100%, but you now have a piece of information that you can take with you, and you can either confirm or find a new piece of information that branches off of that when you get a second opinion. So, the whole point of this article, they did a test with a bunch of doctors and some symptom checking applications, and given the same information, medical history and symptoms for both the applications and the doctors were 72% of the time correct with the diagnosis compared to 34% of the applications. And now that's not to say that they shouldn't use both. They should definitely have some sort of integration of both. And the article goes on to saying how the platform would like to couple both versus pitting them against each other. But there's a huge benefit to someone's personal experiences. And that's why I'm so excited to bring in our guest speaker, because he's got 20 years of experience in the industry. So I know right off the bat, I have plenty of stuff I can learn from him, because I only have like a little over 4 years in the industry. So experience goes a long way. And I'll wrap this up pretty quick. And I'm a little long-winded here, but kind of going along with the doctor's significantly better than Google. The other thing that it makes me think of is a lot of people who reject modern medicine and reject modern modalities and treatments based upon their thought of what our ancestors did. And that's fine and dandy, but it's also to be noted that our ancestors had free range meats, all organic, zero, like very minimal pollutants, from mass farming, clean water. They got exercise all the time. And their average life expectancy was about 30 to 35 years old. And then you fast forward and you come into the 1800s, and we're still around the same life expectancy. But in the last 200 years, we've almost tripled that life expectancy. We're averaging almost up to 75 years for a life expectancy in most nations. So I really highly recommend that you pull up your interwebs and you type in Hans Rosling Health in YouTube. So it's HANS space Rosling, ROSLING space health. And it's a great 4-minute video that really helps change your perspective and helps you understand that we have to acknowledge where we came from and be proud of our accomplishments. But that doesn't mean we have to be satisfied of where we are right now. But I just think it's important to give credit where credit is due.
I think a lot of people are too quick and too eager to self-diagnose, and I don't want to rehash everything you just said, but they go to these extremes, and when in doubt, ask a professional. No matter what it is, refer out to someone.
Yeah, and then if you don't get the answer you like, go get another answer. Go find another professional until you've pooled, a couple of different professionals. And if you start to see there's some repetition in your answers, then you're probably getting closer to your answer. Let's get into open discussion. There's just so much to talk about with the squat, and I'm pretty excited because we joked around about how we could talk about some of these exercises like for an hour straight, and we almost did it the other day, just kind of brainstorming this podcast. So I'm excited that we're actually recording it now. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about why should I squat?
Oh man, it's the king of exercises. We're talking full body compound movement that is essential for life, to get up, to get down. People tell me that they don't squat. It's in my mind, it's silly. It's like, you have to be able to. It's a simple function that we, as humans, everyone should be able to do without difficulty. And time again, I see people throw them out of their programs because they don't like them, they don't see results from them, or they don't see a need for them. And that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like most people who don't like the squat just have some sort of issue with their form that causes them discomfort or pain. They don't know how to get around it, so they just avoid the pain. But yeah, I mean, there's also I think a lot of missteps out there with just sort of the way that people talk about the squat and cue the squat. It really sets people up for failure, and it's not only one of the, I would say, top 3 most important exercises to be doing, but it's also one of the top 3 most ill-performed exercise. But yeah, like you said, the whole body's under tension. You're building a solid foundation for yourself. I would say if I had to make a broad statement about who avoids squats, it'd be men. I think most men avoid squats more than women.
I'd agree with that. And well, now you see on social media is, these women are squatting left and right. And I love it. You want to see that. And then you walk into the gyms and you see these guys that are training, they'll do everything but squats. And I think, like you kind of hit at first, most people are like, well, I hurt myself or it didn't feel right, so I'm going to back off of it. But they never go back and try it again. I tell a lot of people that I have sit downs with, assessments or consult, if you're looking to gain any kind of metabolic demand, lean muscle mass, and you're not squatting, you are missing the boat seriously.
Yeah, I mean, it really doesn't even matter what your goal is. If you're trying to look better, if you're trying to lose weight, if you're trying to perform better in whatever sport you're playing, the squat, I mean, it's just got so many different applications and so many ways to tweak it so it'll make sense to whatever your goal is. I think it's such a great exercise. But like you said, kind of back to the pain thing, I think one of the big issues is just the way that people read about the squat and then get it incorrect. A lot of older men who avoid the squat, like 30 and up, they complain of knee pain. And then I see their squat form, and of course there's a lot of knee pain because they're trying to isolate their knee right above their ankle. For some reason, there's this misconception that you can't let your knees go forward past your toes, when in reality, the squat, unlike the deadlift, involves the triple extension at your ankles, knees, and hips. So from a completely standing neutral anatomical position, if you're trying to squat in a manner that you're going to be most powerful coming out of, you want that whole body to collapse in one unit. Knees come forward, hips come back, and you are ready to just spring out of that position. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about how to start from ground zero. Say that I've been sitting on my couch for the last 3 months and I want to get it right into the squat. What should I start with, Eric?
That's a question I get often, and people are like, what can I do to progress myself towards a squat? And I used to do all these floor exercises, bear crawl position, rock back to feel a squat. But now I tell people, okay, stand on your feet and squat down and let me know how it feels. Obviously, this is with supervision, or if you have a mirror, I tell people, look in the mirror and just see how mechanically you squat. Can you squat deep? Do you squat low? Do you feel tight in certain muscles? Because it all stems back. If you ever watch a baby move, their squats are flawless. They can get in and out of that depth without any issues. And it's amazing as we grow up. Obviously, we get a little bit tighter, but most of us lose the ability for that range of motion. So just to restore that for, say, someone who hasn't squatted down or really squats at all for the last 10 years, that's going to be difficult. It's going to be a new movement for them, but it's just going to be practice. And then once you get a feel for it, body weight, obviously all this is body weight. I never have anyone load right off the bat with a squat pattern until they can feel everything that they need on. So we're talking glutes, hamstrings, abs, and then the quads will come with it. But if they don't have that, I will not load a squat.
Yeah. So basically you're saying don't worry about the floor work. Just get out there, start doing some body weight squats, and through repetition, the right muscles will turn on and you'll eventually be able to get into good form. Is what you're saying? Like don't worry too much about the groundwork to progress yourself to the squat?
I found that a lot of people will do all this progression work or preparatory work, and they're wasting valuable time and valuable minutes a day doing all this floor work and say, okay, I'm going to do this for 3 weeks, then I'm going to squat. Well, why don't you just go try and squat? Because a lot of people will do floor work and they feel great and they can get in position. But once they stand on 2 feet, they have no sense of awareness, and that whole position you had on the ground changes. And that's just going from a supine or prone position to bipedals, 2 feet on the ground, the brain has totally different awareness. So that's where I kind of like to challenge the person right off the bat and say, just go do a squat, try to get as low as you can, see how it feels, and then start working from there.
Yeah, I like how you said get in the mirror, because I feel like a lot of people do things and they can kind of figure out that something's not right, but they don't have that that feedback, that information feedback to really let them know what they're doing right and maybe what is wrong, essentially. So yeah, get in front of a mirror. I like how Elliot Hulse does it. I remember watching a video a couple years ago, and he says that when he first starts somebody off on a squat, he tells them right away, I want you to instinctively move your feet like you're about to squat down and poop in the woods. And it's so funny because I use that with my clients, and they just go to like a nice comfortable position, and then we're squatting good. So everyone's foot positioning and foot angle is going to be a little different based upon bone length, muscle length, any tight areas you may have, and obviously any neuromuscular issues that you may have. Maybe you can't keep your hamstrings on past a certain degree of knee flexion. But yeah, start off with the body weight and get some type of feedback. Maybe record yourself even, or get somebody to watch you and see if they can give you some tips. Watch some videos. I think it's a great way to start, like you said, before you are ready to load up any weight.
You can't even do a rep, say 1 or 2 reps, I'll tell people just go down and sit in that low position and just get your body comfortable sitting in a deep squat. And everyone's squat's going to be a little bit different at first. And I tell people who come and see me, when they say, oh, how deep should I squat? And this is obviously something we'll get into later. And I always say, like, for function, you want to be able to squat all the way down. Like your butt should be on your heels. You should be able to hang out at the bottom and then stand back up. Where you find most people, they get locked up through the hips.
I see a lot of people almost dropping and praying, not staying under tension when they come down. So they miss out on that stretch reflex coming back up, but they almost, you see it, and it happens so much in, I'm going to say it, CrossFit. We'll have to edit that out because it's a curse word, but they drop and then they just try to turn everything on and come up. And it almost looks like they come up and out of it into a good morning. And I just see their lower back, and it hurts me to see it, but their hamstrings shut off, their core's not engaged, and a lot of that tension gets thrown on the erectors and the quads. So it's super important, no matter what depth you can go to, that you stay engaged. And I feel like a lot of the cueing techniques set people up to fail. Like the most popular cueing techniques I hear are, when they describe the squat, is, and I'm just going to say one of them real quick, break at the hip and push your butt back. What do you see the biggest problem with that cueing technique?
Oh man, this is like the bread and butter of the squats. And that technique, and I'm glad you brought that up because that kind of goes hand in hand with pain and dysfunction in the squat. That's such like an 80s, 90s cueing technique. That's an old school method that's been proven more recently in the last 10 years that method isn't optimal for joint health, bone health, or muscle health. That's how I was taught when I was in school, is chest up, drive those hips back, sit back into those hips, and you're creating a bad fulcrum at the hips. And then you load a barbell front or back, doesn't matter. And then you move on it. So to drive up, if your hips are back, they could be flexed and then your back's overextended. And it's just a recipe for disaster. And I think you still see it today. And I think it's still taught in a lot of these training books. I just don't think it's the optimal performance. And I think if you have a population that most people, if you look at their MRIs, they have some kind of bulging disc or disc issue, you shouldn't be squatting with someone with hips back.
Yeah, like the first thing I think of when I hear that cueing technique is anterior pelvic tilt, disengage your core. Like, I just think it's so easy to lose a neutral spine if the first thing you do is break your hips and push your butt back. and you're going to be more likely to, in addition to what you're saying, more likely to load your quads and turn off your hamstrings, than keeping tension in your foundation, your legs, your lower body, which is what you're looking for out of the squat. Another one that goes with that is head and chest up. So you get this on the other end, you get this sort of hyperextension and people extending themselves through their chest, and they don't realize that they're flaring their ribs out and, again, losing their core. Why don't you go ahead and talk about core?
A lot of topics that I want to cover in that statement. And let's first start with the hyperextension. And I think this cue with the hips back, I think this one is more prominently used. I don't know. It was written in a book 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but the chest up is just not a good cueing technique. And so for listeners out there who maybe haven't experienced that kind of squat or seen it, let's just say you put someone in front of the mirror, put a bar on their back, and first thing you say is, okay, chest up, look straight ahead and extend that neck. Once you do that, you put your body into a position of extension. Now, we're extended through the lumbar spine. You might have forward head posture, extension through thoracic spine possibility. And then, like you said, our anterior ribs are coming up. That is going to shut off that anterior core completely. Now you're relying on your erectors, your lower back to basically hold that bar on your back and stabilize your body. Where you mentioned the pelvic floor is if you look underneath that, this is where the hip comes in. Because if you extend your chest up towards the ceiling or out towards a mirror, your lower back arches. Your hips have to shoot back into that anteriorly tilted position. Once your hips go anteriorly tilted, you are losing your pelvic floor underneath you. Your glutes are not going to optimally work. Your adductors are going to be in a position where your body's going to have to rely more on them. They try to hold your pelvic floor up and you get no response from underneath your pelvis. Now, if you look on top of the pelvis, you have the abs. That's the top of your pelvic floor. And then it leads to the diaphragm. Those ribs are up, externally rotated and pulled away from your pelvis. Those abs can't shorten and tighten to hold tension. You are basically blown open in the front. Your diaphragm's in a poor position to work. Your spine's in extension. And then when we get extension, that's where a lot of people see posterior disc issues, because you're basically taking your spine, putting so much pressure on the posterior discs. That's where a lot of people get wear and tear. Then eventually, after that wear and tear, you know how they say the jelly inside the donut, that starts to seep out and people get chronic issues, pain, sciatica.
And the jelly is the soft part between your spinal vertebrae.
Correct. So most people think that kind of goes out first, where if you squat in that pattern continuously, you are going to deteriorate your discs.
Right. Right. And then eventually you might be at bone on bone, and that is just excruciating pain.
And that's the whole point of extension is king, or extension is good in lifting. That's gone out the door. That is not the right way to lift by all means. And it's poor function for any kind of exercise in a squat. And this is where you go back and people say, oh, you know, I've squatted before and I've had pain and issues. And I totally understand that. And I usually tell people that's because you've been squatting the wrong way for so long.
And you know what? I'm glad you said that, because I was just going to say, you might be squatting and you might not feel like anything hurts, but you could be doing improper mechanics. And these little mistakes manifest themselves in bigger problems later down the line. And, you know, one analogy that I use a lot is just, you know, if your flight patterns from LA to Boston and you deviate by a millimeter when you're in LA, you're not gonna end up in Boston, you know, unless there's like a convenient crosswind. But we're not getting into that. But my point is that reassess your squat. And if you're a type of person that likes to lift heavy, you have to incorporate those deload weeks. Those are so beneficial to cleaning up your form and maintaining your good form when you're going to your heavier loads. Little mistakes can lead to big ones later, and those big ones can be life altering. Nobody wants any herniated discs or any sciatic pain, because that stuff is just so hard to make a
And
full
I
recovery
tell
back
people, and I've
from.
had clients that they've had disc issues, they've had herniations, they're completely fine and functional. They can squat with load in the correct position. Now, if I get them into extension, I'm going to aggravate some stuff. So, especially if trainers are listening to this or coaches, just be careful of your population. It doesn't matter if you're young or old. Just make sure that that grind, if it's an extension a lot, can take a toll on the human body. And as professionals, our ultimate goal is to drive fitness. But if someone gets hurt, can we drive that fitness? We just put them on the sideline. So obviously that's going to transform over to performance. And I think we're going to get into that later about different squat styles and methods. But the whole pattern of extension has to go. And I see it a lot on social media too, with I'm gonna say a lot of the women who even back squats, but more the front squats with the kettlebells, is they have the what I like to call the mirror syndrome. They love to look in the mirror. So it's always chest up, looking straight ahead in the mirror. Their back is doing whatever. And the squat still looks good. I mean, you can see the glutes but people listening, when you go and see a page like that, if you can, look at their lower back development. You're going to see erectors that are basically working overtime. Yeah, they're still going to have a good set of glutes, but how optimally are they using those glutes? And you can see it because a lot of them wear the sports bras and they're all lower back. Some of them will look like they'll have a flat lower back just because that lower back is just so used to being an extension. It doesn't know what neutral is, or maybe even flexion.
Yeah, and a lot of times in these videos you see a butt wink. The hips tuck further underneath your legs, and it's because your hamstrings turned off, your quads took over, and then your lower back. Well, I guess you have flexion in your lower back, and your lower back takes a brunt of the work. So if you've ever seen someone squat and you ever see their butt kind of tuck underneath them a little bit right at the end there, that's called a butt wink. And that's typically because they lose that engagement piece. They lose their pelvic floor, and they lose their adductors. They lose their hamstrings. And then they're putting more tension on their lumbar spine, which is ultimately what we want to avoid. And the last poor and outdated cueing techniques, they kind of go hand in hand, is weight on the heels and knees back. They kind of go hand in hand. I see people doing it all the time. And you can see when people do weight on the heels, they come down and they end up, their toes come up and they're almost about to fall back. You want to center that weight in the midline of your foot. And then ideally, the bar is set up, and we'll get into this a little bit later, the bar is set up on your back in such that when you come down, that weight, the bulk of the weight is coming down over the center of your foot. So with the knees back as well, you're getting no ankle mobility into it, and you're just cranking tension into your knees. Yeah, just such a bad position.
I'm kind of glad we got this out of the way early, because this is kind of like the meat and potatoes of poor dysfunction on the squat. I hear that one time and time again, and I actually was going to use that for one of my myth ones. Actually, we might have mentioned it, but the knees going over the toes is okay. And I think a lot of people are afraid of I'm going to get knee pain and all this other stuff if the knee goes over the toes.
You know why I'll always remember that? Because my third round interview for Equinox, they asked us to break down the squat, and I made sure I was over prepared for this interview. So I'm going in depth, and then they had a demonstration, and they're like, what's wrong with this one? And I was the only one to identify a couple of errors, but nobody could identify the fact that his knees were too stabilized over his ankles, and he was too afraid to collapse them over his toes. So I'll always remember that it's okay for your knees to go past your toes, as long as you can keep those heels down. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I feel like that's why those lifters are so popular, because everybody has poor ankle mobility, unfortunately.
I think this can go in a lot of different directions right now. I'm going to keep it with the knee first, and then let's go into the ankle. And I kind of want to get back to that butt wink and kind of let people know what's going on, what I kind of think when I see it happening. But as far as the knees go, if you try to keep your knees and shins too vertical, you're actually putting too much stress on your lower back because your hips have to sit back farther. Your torso has to come down a little bit further to counterbalance you not going forward with the shins. And the more you sit back, the more extension you're going to get.
Yeah, if you think of like a less than or greater than signs, it's just like one of those with at the end, there's just a straight down line. So if you can picture that or draw like a V on its side, and then at the bottom, just draw a line straight down, you could see where a lot of that tension comes into the end of the V on its side, which is your lower back.
Yeah, and that's another one where I'll see people go to like a bench and be like, okay, we're gonna stand right at the bench and squat down and not let your knees go forward. I mean, to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. Now, for people out there who are going to say to themselves, oh, my knee goes over my toes, but I have pain, there's a way to fix that. And you kind of touched on it. If we have a heel through the ground and then we can find our arches through the ground and find a hamstring, that knee can go wherever it wants to over the toes. Now, if you have a heel that's off the ground and maybe a forefoot that's on the ground and that knee's going over the toes, you might feel a lot on that quadricep tendon because that's taking the brunt over.
Which is going to stress that knee. Absolutely. And then one piece that goes along with that is we have, poor ankle mobility. It's because we're just rocking shoes all the time. And what happens is you create a more stable ankle and a tighter calf. So stretch those calves, take those shoes off for your warm up, roll your ankles around, really extend that foot, get that dorsiflexion, get that plantar flexion, pull your toes to your knees, and really try to regain that mobility in your ankle, because it's going to go a long way towards you performing the squat. You got to think that your first connection piece with the squat is your feet on the ground. And those are always going to be your first line of offense towards your proprioceptors, towards basically turning on the right muscles of your body so that you can perform the exercise appropriately.
And I see a lot of people go after the ankles a lot and really hard, really, really fast. And I always tell people that's not a bad idea, but it's not just your ankles. Now, if you're getting tight shins or you have poor ankle mobility, go back up the chain. I would say if you're in a constant state of extension, that means your calves are probably locked on. You're not going to be able to open up those ankles if you're still in a state of extension. So you can do all the ankle mobility stretches you want and feel good, but if you try to go squat and extension, you're going to go back to your poor patterns. You have to change your whole body mechanics, and then you can see those ankles really open up. And I tell people, I've had people, just by fixing glutes and hamstrings, their ankle mobility increases drastically, and we didn't even stretch it. And that's just another way I kind of look at, the whole system of the body of the squat is it's not just one area. If you're getting locked up somewhere, there's multiple places that you're disconnecting from your brain or your muscles are disconnecting that you can't function properly.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad you said it. Kind of something along the lines is basically just the whole body is one big pulley system, and the squat can identify weaknesses in your body. And that's not to say that you're weak. That's not a negative thing. That's a good thing. The first thing we have to start doing, right, is identifying the problem before we can fix it. So, use the squat as a tool. And, like we said, from body weight to barbell, I would say my personal preference is start working on dumbbells, front load that, hold that dumbbell close to your chest. It's going to help engage your core. And once you can work up to about 50-pound dumbbell, 60-pound dumbbell, then you're good to go to the barbell, because the barbell is going to be 45 pounds. The weight's going to be further away from your focal point, so it's going to be a lot more difficult, but you're going to get a lot more core engagement because of it. Yeah, do you want to add anything to that? Because we actually have a couple. We have like 20 minutes left, and we have a lot more to go.
Touch quick back to the butt wink and kind of the mechanics of that, so people can kind of understand that. So when I see a butt wink, and usually I don't see it quite often because I think people stop before they go. I think we're looking at your system's in complete extension through a lower back and you're anterior tilted. that your hips can't go further back and extend anymore, that your hips have to come back under you. And I was looking at it the other day and I was thinking, okay, well, that butt wink is just those hamstrings trying to pull your bottom of your pelvis back underneath you for optimal position. And that's just telling me that this person started in a bad position, because that's where the hips want to be. If they have their anterior core on and their spine in neutral, that's where their hips are going to end up. So if you're out there getting a butt wink, that butt wink is telling you that your position is off. And it's not just tighten the core. You have to get your hips under you to pull straight down and have hamstring leverage, because your hips can't go further back. If you keep going further back and your spine keeps extending, you're going to snap that. The body's not going to let it happen. So that's why it winks. That's just my thought and what I see day to day.
Yeah. So 2 pieces I just want to make sure I mention that before we move on is to help with your butt wink. Hamstrings, and Menchie, you introduced me to the half kneeling hamstring hold with the breathing. And I love that because, right away when I see clients kick their foot down and then grab their hamstring and they're spasming, I know right away it's a neuromuscular issue. So, for anyone listening, you get down, half kneeling position, you're in a 90-90 position, meaning your one foot is flat on the ground, your knee is right in front of your hip, and your knee is also right above your ankle. Then you have your other knee is straight down underneath your hip, and your ankle straight back from your knee. And you're actively pulling your hamstring, not with your hands, but just with your legs. You're squeezing that hamstring. You're actually pulling your heel to your butt while you give a nice forced exhale. And you sip a little bit of air through your nose and another forced exhale so that you can engage and relax and breathe through and try to get more muscle engagement. It's a great warm-up, great way to fire on those hamstrings. And then, like you said, pulling yourself down with your hamstrings, I think goes right along with the cueing technique of squeeze your glutes. And the first thing that you should do is have those knees dip forward, and then butt is underneath you with your rib cage down, and you're pulling yourself down with your hamstrings. So the other piece is box squats. I think it's a huge benefit to stopping somebody at the point at which challenges their engagement, because I see a lot of people get butt winks before they reach their thighs parallel to the ground, but their mobility allows them to go almost ass to grass. So I love kind of progressing them lower and lower, but while maintaining that slow and controlled movement, tapping the box and driving right back up. So just two good ways to fix the butt wink. And I want to pose some questions your way to help start to get into more specifics of the squat. So low bar squats versus high bar squats. What's up with that?
The difference is about 2 to 3 inches. Lower bar is about 3 inches down on your back, which creates a little more forward torso angle. And the high bar is just higher up on the upper traps. Both are used. The high bar is used a little bit more. The low bar is more for like power lifters. But for a lot of athletic movements, the high bar can translate greater to on-field performance, and it puts the torso at a better angle to train at if you're training explosive movements like a hang clean or any kind of Olympic lift, because it trains the torso to be a little bit more upright. And that just changes a little bit dynamics of hamstring glute activation, low bar versus high bar. I tell people it's kind of whatever your preference is. I'm mostly high bar just because I've done it almost all my life that way. I've tried low bar. I just don't have the good position on my back for it. But I tell people, you can mess around with it because it changes the whole exercise dynamic.
Well, you also have some disc issues, right?
Yes.
Do you notice a difference in any issues between low and high bar?
No. More I can tell if I'm an extension. Then I'll notice I can feel my back turn on and I can feel that issue. But low bar, high bar doesn't change it. I just can't do heavy weight low bar because it's a little bit lower on my back and I'm not used to it.
See, that's funny you said that because I was just going to say when it comes to low bar squatting, I can't do super, super heavy weight because it just cranks on my wrists.
I think for people listening, if most people have done high bar, stick with high bar. You're still squatting. You're still going to get the benefits. Just know that you're not going to you're not going to be as strong in that position, and don't feel like you need to do one or the other. You can do both.
What about wide stance versus narrow stance?
Just like the low bar and high bar, wide versus narrow are two different exercises. Narrow squats are functional. They are great. Personally, or a sport specific squat, I think they have more translation to athletic performance than a wide squat. Now, you see a lot of wide squats with powerlifting, strongman. If you want to move a lot of weight, you go wide because you can change the distance. It makes it a little bit shorter to squat down. Is that bad? No. Where it's more narrow, you actually challenge the system more biomechanically to function and to act. I think people like to go wide because they feel more stable. Now, here's where it gets to be two different exercises. You go wide, you're recruiting a whole different, not just say a whole different group, similar muscles, but with different.
I feel like you're focusing more on like your external rotators than you are like your adductors.
Yeah, with different planes of motions, you're moving around. And the most of the people I get, they go wide, and I bring them in narrow and say, okay, let's squat down here. And they can't move for crap. And I think that's where a lot of people need to start heading towards, is this narrow squat. Because when you run or you walk or you play most sports, we're never in a real wide stance. Gait is within shoulder width apart. So we have to be narrow. For runners and athletes listening, if you want to get good and powerful in positions, start squatting narrow. Get some narrow stance in. Got to use those hamstring glutes in that position. What I find is a lot of times with the wide squat, is you kind of hinted on it with the external rotation, that kind of drive. And people will say you'll get more glute max activation. But when you go wide and maybe toes out, you're now changing the whole exercise because you're now rotating femurs and tibs and fibs externally, which have a different action on the body. I tend to tell people to kind of be leery of wide stance because in toes out, because that external rotation can now put us back into that anteriorly tilted hip, which now your pelvic floor is off, your core is off. You have no leverage. If you're looking for optimal strength and performance, if you're going a little bit narrower, you're going to have more control, more activation through the correct muscles and movements. You're gonna feel better and perform better. I very rarely have people wide squat. I think it just creates more torque on the body.
Yeah, I completely agree. I see a lot of people go super wide, like aggressively wide, and you can even see their foot starts to like outwardly tilt just ever so slightly. And I can't help but think that they don't have a pelvic flooring. They aren't firing through their adductors, which is connected to their pelvic flooring. And thus they're just throwing a lot of tension onto their hips. And like you said, like when you get people who are used to doing a really wider stance coming in a little narrow, and I'm not talking like feet together, but I'm thinking like shoulder width apart, your toes are slightly turned out a little bit, and that's a great stance. You're going to be really powerful there, like you were saying, because you're more proximal to your body. You're not distal. You're not pulling your legs further and further apart, ultimately stretching yourself thin and limiting your mobility. If you think of like literally like your muscle having strings on it, if you pull your legs wide and try to squat, you're asking that to get a further distance versus if you bring your legs in and squat from that position. Now, the big missing piece that people lose out on when they're squatting is that pelvic flooring. And you see a lot of people use belts, and we talked about this a little bit last time because we had an email from Will. Your pelvic flooring is that intra-abdominal pressure using air as a way to pressurize your lower abdominals and your pelvic region as a way to create a foundation for your anterior core, for the rest of your core coming all the way up to your rib cage. That's going to play a huge role in keeping everything engaged, from hamstrings to glutes to core. It's going to play a huge role in your performance and play a huge role into anything else that you're doing outside of the gym, because you're able to maintain tension throughout your whole body. Is there anything else you want to add to the pelvic flooring? I know you're really good about explaining that one, so I did kind of want you to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll dive in. Just want to say that all those variations of the squats are great to do. you should be able to drop down in that position without issue. What I think happens is a lot of people get stuck in this wide stance, toes turned out. Let's drive the knees out. Now, what that does is, like I mentioned, it puts the femurs into external rotation. You might get some tibiofibular external rotation. As those femurs go into external rotation, your acetabulum has to move on top of that femur. So most of the time, your acetabulum moves on the femur, it anterior tilts, abducts, and flexes. So now you're putting yourself in a position where that pelvic floor cannot work. And that's what the issue I have with the wide stance is, because most people get wide and they don't even know how to control a pelvic floor underneath them. Tell them to tuck their hips under, they cannot.
Yeah, because you're just way too wide. And I'm gonna add one piece into it because you educated me on this, and I'm directly basically quoting you. But a lot of the time your mobility is due to your spine position, which is going to be based off your SI position, left and right hip position. And if you can engage those hamstrings at half kneeling hamstring hold, actively pulling your hamstrings down, maintaining that pelvic flooring, you're going to help reset your spine to a neutral position. That's going to help stabilize you, allowing you more mobility out of your hips and allowing you to get more control through your glutes and your hamstrings in the squat.
Yeah, kind of touch on the pelvic floor. I know you wanted me to get into that, and we can definitely dive into that. You have to look at the upper body and lower body portions of it. You have a pelvis that sits underneath you and a rib cage that sits on top. Big cue I use is ribs down on top will set the top of that cylinder. So you have one on top, you got the half of the cylinder locked in. If your bottom isn't locked in tight with that cylinder and completes it, you're just moving dysfunction on dysfunction. And that's where the pelvic floor people lose control, because they can't get their hips underneath them and their adductors to work to stabilize. Most people don't think about that, but adductors are actually core muscles. I'll kind of explain it to you. So, and this is how someone explained it to me, is if you flip that pelvis upside down. So if I was on my head and you look at the bottom of the pelvis, just like if we were to look at our abs, our obliques, what helps that pelvic floor to kind of pull together and make that bowl with the legs there? Those adductors, they'll help. If you're abducted flexed, they will help pull your hips back and then adduct them. So now you have a pelvic floor underneath you, you can move. And if people can't keep that floor underneath them, that's when they get into serious trouble with back issues. Because if you don't have the glutes and the hamstrings and the adductors up top, it's going to be compromised.
Then you're all quad and low back. Yeah, you said it. You hit the nail on the head. Probably the only other piece that I wanted to talk about, I know we're like running on no time, but just briefly, when is it time to back squat? When is it time to front squat?
I'm more of a back squatter. As the years have gone by and I've coached it a lot more, I'm perfectly fine with coaching a back squat. Now, do I coach it with everyone? No. I do like front rack squats. For people starting out, definitely goblet squats with dumbbells. Stay that route for a long time if you have the anterior core on. Barbell front squats, on the other hand, I find people have a tough time getting underneath the bar and keeping their abs on without going into extension, because the lats are a factor in that one. So the barbell front squat is kind of out for me, most people, if they can't control those lats. So I'm more of a back squat. Can I put a bar on your back? Can you keep ribs down, hips underneath you, glute hamstring on, drop down to that position, drive back up? Absolutely. But if you're starting off front racked, if you feel that you don't lower back or you're scared to back squat, you can front rack squat for the rest of your life, as long as you have everything on.
Yeah. So like basically what Menchie's saying is that front rack position, your elbow tight to your rib cage, shoulder retracted back, fist right into your chest. It's kind of like your front rack position. Your knuckles are facing up, so that when you're holding the kettlebell, it's not cranking on your wrist. But essentially, because when we front squat, you need your hand on the bar and your elbows up underneath coming forward to help engage your lats, which help keep your core engaged. A lot of people don't have that shoulder mobility, or they have super tight triceps and lats that they can't get into that position anatomically. So I completely agree. Throw those kettlebells in there for those front squats if you're having issues. I love the application of the front squat because it allows, I feel like it helps maintain a tighter core, especially when you're starting out and learning the back squat. I feel like it's a good tool to help engage that core. But I completely agree. Back squat all the way. I think it's got better applications. I think it's got better mechanics involved that allow you to go heavier weights without being compromised by something as simple as tight lats.
Yeah, and I even see with people go heavy kettlebells, they'll compensate and they'll go right into extension, and it defeats the purpose of it. So if you feel like you're at a point where you want to start really going heavier, go back squat. You'll be all right. If you can control the position in a front squat, back squat's no different, and you'll just see your performance and your goals even soar higher.
Yep. So you have any closing statements for us, Menchie?
Yes, if anyone out there listening has not checked out the Arthur squat model, go check that out. There's one link on Postural Restoration Institute. That is a great video. It's about 45 minutes long, but one of the fathers of strength and conditioning talks about the optimization of the squat. So if you want good reference on how to squat or techniques we talked about during this podcast, go check out that video. It's got great insights. And if you watch the video and still have questions, feel free to reach out to us and email us. We can break that down just so people know that I am a part of the Postural Restoration Institute. And if you have any questions on that stuff, feel free to reach out to me through the email.
Beautiful. Well said. I'm glad you brought that up because I totally forgot. We forgot to talk about West Side Barbell versus Arthur Squat. But yeah, go check out the Arthur Squat method. Squat early, squat often. Don't neglect it. Don't avoid it. It's just going to make it harder when you eventually have to face it. And that's it. That wraps us up. Like I said, next week, hopefully getting a guest speaker, Mike Urso, in here. And yeah, thanks for listening.